Well, hello everyone. That was surprising. It's funny when I get surprised by my own coming alive. Well, this is going to be one of the typically unorganized shows that you know and have certain feelings about. So we are going to be covering, for those of you who aren't as entrenched in I don't like the way my neckline is all, it's all weird. That's better. Libertarian lore. It is the crying Hawaiian Austin Peterson. Oh my God, that was a Freudian slip. Austin Martin's appeal to the National Libertarian Party Judicial Committee. It is in its formative stages and also in chat. I'm still a problem going live on Twitter. So if you're watching on Twitter, please, if you could, comment in chat using, comment on Twitter. And it should appear on my screen. And also put the link to where it's showing up live because it's not on my feed. All right. I'm going to be saying that each time. But it's his appeal to the Judicial Committee. It's in its infancy, if we want to put it that way. There isn't a hearing scheduled yet, and I am sure there is going to be filings, particularly from a particular person. But so far, all that's been filed in the matter. Yay, can you, Mr. Blue Boyle, could you stick the link as to where you're seeing this? Like the Twitter link? You know, if you go over to bookmark, it has copy link, because I would love to see where it's showing up on Twitter, but I'm glad it is in fact showing up on Twitter. So there will be additional responses in this matter, but so far all there is Austin Martin's appeal, the LNC's response, which was written by Jonathan McGee and is very well done, and I filed an amicus. I would encourage those of you who want to shut this down to also file an amicus. On a lot of appeals, there really is several, at least sometimes more than two, reasonable positions. And, you know, it's a difficult decision to see which one is stronger than the others. I can very confidently say this appeal is utter dog crap. There are not two sides. There really aren't, from many multiple angles, but we're going to go over it. Why not? Let's go over it. So before I do that though, and if anyone's wondering why I look over to the side, is I do have a second monitor which has some of my live stream controls, and can you see that? I use a trackball, and it often gets lost. Like I'm trying to get it over to that other screen. Yeah, this is the right screen. Oh, here we go. Never mind. I figured it out. Subscribe. I would really appreciate if you did, because libertarians aren't joiners. I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe. And also, you can follow me on Twitter at Karen Ann Harlow's. Been having some decently successful tweets lately. And also, this is certainly not least, I would appreciate your support on Patreon at patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. Over this weekend, I am going to be recording the next installment of my critique of the case against Christian nationalism. And I do release that early to my Patreon supporters. So I really appreciate it. And hey, Nolan Schmidt, you're really going to want to pay attention to this stuff, since Nolan, let me take this off the screen here for once. I lost my freaking trackball again. Where is it? Literally, there it is. Anyone who has a trackball and two screens, you feel my pain. I want to put Nolan's screen up, Nolan's comment up here, because Nolan is running for the Judicial Committee. So maybe I'll have him on sometime and we'll talk about his particular philosophy if he wishes so. Okay, that'd be interesting to have several Judicial Committee candidates on the show. Anyway, let's get into this, shall we? So I am looking now for my next screen, and what I'm going to pull up. So if you guys want to know where you can find filings for the Judicial Committee, this isn't shade against Evan. I was an overachiever, but I used to put this, never mind. We're not even going to get into it. You can find nearly everything you want on Lpedia. But Lpedia is sometimes not the most intuitive, but I really suggest you get familiar with it because a lot of party records are there. So let's go to this other screen, and I have Lpedia up. Let me put this up. Let me make myself a little smaller because I'm not what's important here. So if you go to Lpedia and you search Judicial Committee 2022 through 2026, let me go back. Let me show you how to find this stuff. So if we go back here, I'll show you how I found it. So if you go to the homepage of Lpedia and you're like, oh, I want to find this Austin Martin case. Well, you got to find the Judicial Committee. So you see Judicial Committee 2022 through 2026 because they serve a 4-year term. This is down here where it says cases. This is all their cases they've had this year. You can see the first one was one filed by me about the joint fundraising agreement in which I believe the JC face planted. But, you know, that's the way it goes. But down here's the latest one. In Re, to declare invalid the LNC action purporting to void the Region 1. God, this is a title that is as long as like a 19th century book, 18th century book. To declare invalid the LNC action purporting to void the Region 1 election of May 10th, 2025, and to clarify the interpretation of sustaining membership status, rights, and regional autonomy. We're just going to call it Martin versus LNC. So there's a link, and this is where we're going. So this is what I had up on the screen that I was showing you guys before. So now you know how to get to there at Lpedia. Do support the work of Lpedia. That's the one thing that I'm still involved in with the National Party because it's maintaining our history. So I made myself a little bit larger here. Actually, I want to change this to the circular one. I don't know if I can do that. Hold on. If I can't do it quickly, I won't. Camera link. I can't figure out how to do it quickly. So I'm not good with the technology. It's bugging me, though, because I like the circular one better. Okay, so we are going to look at what Mr. Martin filed. So the way Judicial Committee rule, how it gets started, I guess, is the way. If you go to the LP bylaws and you scroll down, there are the rules for the Judicial Committee. And I do have the bylaws on my laptop. We're probably going to end up bringing them up at some point. And Judicial Committee members need to be familiar with the bylaws. So you have to file something within the jurisdiction of the Judicial Committee. And what Austin Martin is filing is claiming that a certain decision of the LNC violates the bylaws. Okay, so we're going to get into that because I don't think he's met that burden. I also don't think I don't think this should be even heard by the JC at this point, and we'll get into this. So I am scrolling down, and we're going to the documents submitted to the Judicial Committee. So we're going to look up petition for appeal. I don't know if that's big enough. Let me look at my screen here. Well, you all know where to find it. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger on the screen, though. And we're going to go over this. Again, this is very inside baseball. Okay. Notice it says Austin Martin, sustaining member, on behalf of petitioners. This is going to become important in a minute. So he gives a jurisdiction. The appeals submitted pursuant to bylaws Article 7, Section 12 of the bylaws of the Libertarian Party. Actually, in order to make this a meaningful show, let's actually look up the actual bylaws right now. We're going to lp.org. Oh, okay, before we go there, though, it's really embarrassing that the LP has not fixed this yet. You see this dude here? Look at that, like, lobster claw AI generated finger he's got. So freaking embarrassing. That's been pointed out so many times. In any event, we're going to go to the bylaws. So he said Article 7, Section 12. So let's go down to Article 7, Section 12. And see if I can highlight this here. Upon appeal by 10% of the delegates credentialed at the most recent regular convention, which would have been DC in 2024, or 1% of the party sustaining members, the Judicial Committee shall consider the question of whether or not a decision of the National Committee contravenes specified sections of the bylaws. If the decision is vetoed by the Judicial Committee, it shall be declared null and void. Okay, so that's what he was quoting. I think I'm finding another problem with his appeal, by the way. So we're going to go back. Okay, we're going to cut him some slack, but let's go down here. It says, shall consider the question of whether or not a decision of the LNC contravenes a specified section of the bylaws. We'll see if he actually specifies sections of the bylaws that were contravened. At the very end here, after the convention rules, you'll see are the Judicial Committee Rules of Appellate Procedure. This is what governs the JC. Okay, keep that in mind. Let's go back to this. Okay. The challenge sections, you can tell this was written by AI, by the way. It repeats itself. It's not dense. It's not logical. That's my opinion. You can disagree. The challenge actions contravene the LP bylaws, the party's adopted parliamentary authority, blah, blah, blah. Long-standing party practice. The JC has no authority to overturn things just because it's long-standing party practice. That is persuasive, but that's not jurisdictional. And notice this is under jurisdiction. Okay. Petitioners. Petitioners consist of at least 10% of the delegates credentialed at the most regular convention and/or at least 1% of the sustaining members of the party. Which is it? You need to say what it is. It can't be and/or. A list of them is attached as Exhibit 1. A list is not sufficient. We're going to get into that in more detail when we look at my amicus. I keep looking up because I haven't cleaned the cobwebs yet from my studio, and they're really bothering me. So the effective parties, James Wiley, the Region 1 delegation. There was no Region 1 delegation, you literal walnut. I didn't notice this before. There was no Region 1 delegation. Okay, we're going to go back to my other screen here for a minute because I want to talk about this more in full, because this is something that I helped engineer and I regret it. And I'm not going to give you excuses. I'm just going to say I was wrong. I wasn't wrong according to the bylaws. It is allowed by the bylaws, but it was not the right thing to do. And I'm not going to give you excuses. Unlike some of the libertarians that in 2026 found their morals and now are against Trump, but want to go, yeah, but I thought, I don't care what you thought. Just own it. I was wrong. So what happened is I noticed that there was a loophole in the bylaws in which the regional chairs could just select what region they were going to be in and who their initial representatives would be without having a regional caucus in which the delegates made those decisions. Now, it was traditional that the delegates made those decisions, but it was not required. So me and Michael Heiss convinced a bunch of Mises-friendly chairs or actual Mises caucus chairs to, prior to convention, form a super region of at least 20% of National Party sustaining members, just decided on their own, not decided by delegates, and to pick their regional representatives. Now, it was customary for state chairs to decide to join a region. That part, there was nothing shady in doing that with him and I. You kind of have to do that ahead of time. But to pick the regional representatives ahead of time, that it was allowed by the bylaws, but I regret doing it. And I'm not going to give you any excuses. So let's go back now to that screen. Now that you know the background, there was no Region 1 delegation. And after convention, there's no Region 1 delegation that elects its representatives. It's the regional chairs. Now, in some sense, you can consider that a delegation. But tell me, and I really, really want to see comments on this. And remember, super chats matter because this is really inside baseball stuff. In any event, when you hear Region 1 delegation, you think delegates. You don't think chairs, do you? Okay. Other affected party, obviously the LNC. Sustaining members of the party, obviously. All party members. Oh, God. Then why did you have to bring it out with sustaining members of the party? This is so written by AI and affiliate parties. Okay. Let's scroll down. Oh, excuse me, I have hiccups. Oh, and I'm one of those people who get hiccups and I'll have them for days. It's miserable. Factual background. Okay, I'm just going to give you the summary. We're not going to read this AI screed. Let's go back here. So what happened is there was a vacancy in Region 1 representative. Specifically, there was a vacancy in the 2 alternates. Remember, Region 1 gets 2 representative and 2 alternates because they are a super region. No thanks to me. So there was vacancy in the 2 alternate positions. The region chairs had an email ballot, which is allowed by the regional agreement, which I wrote, that was allowed by the region. And there's nothing wrong with having an email ballot, by the way. I'm just saying this is a subject matter of which I am intimately familiar. So there was an email ballot, and Austin Martin and James Wiley were purportedly elected as regional alternates. I was national secretary at the time. I did the onboarding of both Austin and James. And as part of the onboarding, I verify, which is the job of the secretary, their eligibility to hold the role. The National Party bylaws say you have to be a sustaining member in order to serve on the LNC. Jim Wiley was not a sustaining member. His membership had lapsed 2 months prior. I informed Stephen Nikela, the chair, and he instructed me to post that Mr. Wiley was ineligible, therefore he was not the Region 1 alternate. And I think I posted at the time, or Stephen said at the time, that Region 1, that if Mr. Wiley would pay his dues, Region 1 could re-elect him, basically. Okay. There was an LNC meeting within a very short period of time of all of this happening. It was an LNC meeting in Grand Rapids. Mr. Wiley did not show up at that meeting. If Mr. Wiley really believed he was an LNC member, he should have showed up at that meeting. Just like the December Rhode Island meeting, where I was illegitimately, allegedly suspended, and it turns out I wasn't because it was voided by the Phillies' decision. But the LNC didn't recognize that. What did my happy ass do? I showed up at that meeting because I acted consistently with my belief that I was still the LNC secretary. And it turns out I was right. But Wiley didn't show up. In any event, Mr. Martin raised a point of order saying that Mr. Wiley was legitimately elected. The chair ruled his point of order not well taken. No matter my personal disagreements presently with Stephen Nikela, he was absolutely right in that decision. Mr. Martin appealed from the ruling of the chair, as was his right. The chair's ruling was sustained. After that time, Region 1 had another election. They called it a ratification. I'm not going to quibble on words. It really wasn't a ratification. It was another election. Mr. Wiley was elected, and he was legitimately the second Region 1 alternate. Are you following the story? So it all resolved itself within less than a week, I think. Okay, so we don't need to go through that. I gave you that very quickly. All right, here's the arguments. Mr. Wiley was a member in good standing at the time of election. No, he was not. And any alleged lapse, there was a lapse. He doesn't even disagree that there was a lapse. Was promptly cured under the bylaws and Robert's Rules of Order. It was cured. It was not cured under the bylaws or Robert's Rules of Order. So it goes on to define what sustaining members are: people who have donated $25 within the past 12 months. Now, he goes on to claim that under RONR, a member in arrears and dues retains the full rights of a voting member unless the bylaws expressly provide for automatic suspension. These are not full rights of a voting member. The ability to be on a board is not a full right of a voting member. And in fact, let me give you a full right of a voting member, I would say, so the national bylaws say that you can vote at convention. That's what a voting member means. It doesn't mean you get to serve on a board. It doesn't mean that you get to be on the LNC. It means if paying dues gives you certain rights to vote, that you still have those rights to vote unless the bylaws expressly provide for automatic suspension. I'm giving his interpretation its full weight. I'm not going to say whether that interpretation is entirely correct. That's something to do with the bylaws committee, but it's just not applicable here. Where it would be applicable is that the national bylaws say in order to be a national delegate, that's a voting right. You have to either be a member of your state party or a national member. So in this case, if we were talking about a convention where there was a member in arrears who was not a member of their state party, but was a member in arrears of their national party, an argument could be had that they are still eligible to be a delegate. That's not the issue here. Please let me know if anyone has any questions. Then it goes on to say, no officer had authority to unilaterally void a Region 1 election under the bylaws, because he's claiming that the bylaws explicitly vest authority over the selection, removal, and replacement of regional representatives and alternates comprising each region, and it says they may be removed and replaced only by an act of the affiliate parties. Okay, I got to go to this screen here for just 1 second, so give me one moment. All right. Again, ask me questions in chat if you have any. Neither the chair or secretary is granted unilateral authority to declare a regional election void. I'm going to get into that in my response. Okay. Suspension of membership rights. There were no membership rights. Without notice or process is prohibited by the bylaws or parliamentary authority. So the bylaws provide mechanisms for discipline and removal. That presumes that he was a member. He was not. And goes on to say that this would have required a disciplinary hearing. Okay. Once he renewed his sustaining membership, there were no factual or legal basis to deny his rights or invalidate his election. God, you could tell AI wrote this, and it's just giving me such a headache. Arbitrary, capricious, and inconsistent with party practice. It certainly wasn't arbitrary. There are qualifications to be an LNC member in the bylaws. He did not meet them. Then certainly it wasn't capricious, and it was not inconsistent with party practice, but that is somewhat irrelevant if the first two aren't true. And Austin just does not understand the statement of principles. The challenge actions undermine the statement of principles. Where? Affiliate autonomy, and established party practice. Notice party practice was repeated here. And again, this is like such AI. So they refer to, he refers to rights and Epstein. Epstein had nothing to do with people being a member on the LNC. So he doesn't really explain how Epstein 2015 is irrelevant. But in rights, Lee writes, was already validly elected as an LNC member. His membership lapsed, and the membership deemed that was an automatic vacation of the seat. I actually think they were correct, but with some nuance that I'll get into in my amicus. That is not what happened here. So you all can read this for yourself, but hopefully I gave you the overview. So this is the relief requested. Declare that James... Now, note that James Wiley has since resigned from the LNC and joined the Republican Party. He's not a Colorado State Party member anymore. He is a national sustaining member because all you need to do is pay money for that. When was all this happening? I think this was around February, May. Well, no, he says here May. So let's see if he renews. I'm sure he will. Declare James Wiley was a sustaining member in good standing at the time of his election or at the latest upon renewal on May 15th. Of course, he was a sustaining member when he renewed. Declare that no officer had the authority to suspend his membership. There were no suspensions of membership. But the Region 1 election, purported election, was declared void, and you don't need regional action or formal disciplinary process for that. And the chair didn't do that unilaterally. There was a challenge of the ruling of the chair, and the LNC voted on it. Declare that the LNC action purporting to sustain the chair's ruling was invalid. Affirm the validity of his election. Clarify that membership rights may not be suspended for dues lapse absent explicit bylaw authority and due process. Of course, that did not happen. Recommend adoption of clear and uniform procedures governing sustaining membership lapses. Notice opportunities to cure consistent with the bylaws and Robert's Rules of Order. Okay, we're going to get into all that. So that's where we're at. We're going to go to the LNC's response, which was very, very good. I believe it was written by McGee. I don't know if he signed it, but I believe he wrote it. He did sign it. Okay. Let's make this bigger. That's what she said. Okay. Gives the same factual thing. So, arguments. Mr. Wiley was not a sustaining member as defined by the bylaws at the time of the purported initial election, which is undisputably true. He did not, during the prior 12 months, donated or have donated on his behalf an amount of at least $25. And the argument that the LNC is making, the petitioner correctly cites that the bylaws have no explicit provisions that declare elapsed sustaining members automatically suspended or losing voting rights. However, petitioner is not entirely accurate in claiming that under R&R, a member in arrears retains the full rights of a voting member. He says R&R provides for a much broader exception regarding the bylaws. I actually think it's well argued, this argument, but it's irrelevant. This has nothing to do with voting rights as a sustaining member, qua sustaining member. So while I don't, this argument is not necessary, but it does say, except as the bylaws may otherwise provide. And it says here that the requirements to be the National Committee member is a National Committee member shall be a sustaining member of the party and shall not be the candidate of any other party. Okay. So they get into eligibility, and that is what the issue is here. Okay. Neither the National Committee nor any of the regional affiliates have the authority to elect an individual ineligible per the national bylaws. Absolutely correct. And I want to show you something here that shows that even in the ballot, they recognize it. So we're going to go to the exhibits on the appeal. Okay, I'm trying to find. Notice this. So Andrew Chatterton, in starting the ballot, says, you may vote for any individual eligible for the position. even in the ballot itself, it recognized that they had to be eligible. Okay. And this whole argument by autonomy, this is something that needs to die in a fire. And I know I'm not going to be popular for saying this. Oh God, I was going through the appeal and I didn't have the right screen up. Oh, well, you guys got to hear it and you could follow along. Sorry, I didn't realize that that screen wasn't up. I know libertarians like to say, don't tell me what to do. And I agree, unless you've entered into a contract. Then you do need to abide by the terms of the contract. No matter how much wailing and gnashing of teeth goes on here, the affiliates are not completely autonomous. Neither are you as a party member. No one's forcing you to be in the party. No one is forcing an affiliate to be an affiliate. They are granted great autonomy, but they're not fully autonomous. I'm tired of this argument. It's a lie. And under Austin Martin's own assertions that misrepresenting situations is a violation of the statement of principles, he is violating the statement of principles. Now, I don't believe that, because the statement of principles, as I dealt with in another show, has to do with the function of the state. But by his own arguments, he would be. But affiliates are not completely autonomous. That's a lie. Any state party, if they wish, could be completely autonomous. Disaffiliate from the national party, and then you could do whatever you want. But affiliates are actually subordinate organizations under the national bylaws. They can do anything that's pretty much not prohibited, but that doesn't mean they can do anything. So here's Article 5.5 of the national bylaws, which says, the autonomy of the affiliates and sub-affiliates shall not be abridged by the national committee or any other committee of the party, except as provided by these bylaws. So they basically say you can do what you wish, except for things that these bylaws talk about. That is great freedom, but it's not complete, absolute freedom. Any affiliate party can disaffiliate and be absolutely free except for whatever the laws of their state were. In fact, there are a lot of state-only political parties. Vermont has quite a few of them. But you can't use the trademark of the National Libertarian Party. And if you want to be part of the National Libertarian Party, you need to abide by the national bylaws. That's part of your contractual agreement. And some might go, yeah, but we can't run a national candidate without being part of a national party. You don't have to be a part of this national party. You can join with some other people who just want no rules, like not these kinds of rules or whatever, and be completely autonomous. God, I don't like the way this is. I got this shirt at Goodwill, and this is probably why it was at Goodwill. The neckline's all weirdly stretched out, but it's a cool shirt though. Check it out. I think it's pretty cool. And in any event, you don't have to be part of this national party. All right, going back. While regional affiliates and alternates, may be removed and replaced by an act of the affiliate parties, it says in no way does that mean that the national bylaws authorize affiliates to suspend the eligibility requirements. And McGee also notes that at the top of the original ballot for the election, the state chairs are instructed they may vote for any individual eligible for the position. So even in the ballot itself, Austin Martin is full of shit. Then he goes on to say that the earlier election was a continuing breach of the bylaws. And he cites Roberts, and this is a correct citation. And I'm sure there's another one that I am going to read later. Okay. He clearly consented, but I would actually disagree a little bit with this argument. because the election didn't become final because it wasn't an election at all because he wasn't eligible. Okay. So I think it's just a semantical argument here. The chair and the National Committee have the authority to contest the announced results if they're a continuing breach of the bylaws. He goes on to cite the authority of the chair. He is correct. And it says R.O.N.R. Further clarifies the procedure for contesting an election in continuing breach of the bylaws. And this bolded part is really important because normally, and we got into this with the Hector Kangaroo stuff, where he was trying to say certain national elections at the convention were not valid because certain people were allowed to vote that shouldn't have been allowed to vote. That had to be challenged at the time of the convention. Challenges, typically points of order, things like that, need to be timely or they are waived. But there are some exceptions to general timeliness. And also, well, we don't need to get into some of the peculiarities as to, like, if the count was wrong, it is the electing body itself that can challenge the count. And the LNC wasn't the electing body. But that's not the issue here. That was the issue with the Roos thing. The convention was dissolved at adjournment sine die. But here, other exceptions to the general timeliness requirement are those that come from the 5 categories listed in 23.6, in which case a point of order can be raised at any time during the continuance in office of the individual declared elected. And here's letter A. If the individual does not meet the qualifications for the post established by the bylaws, i.e. here being a sustaining member, his or her election is tantamount to the adoption of a main motion that conflicts with the bylaws. So, yes, the purported election of Wiley is exactly what that sort of thing is talking about. Then he goes on to distinctions from the previous JC decisions, and he argues, same thing what I said, in rights centered around the removal of Lee rights in the middle of his term. And there's a really good conclusion. I actually, I suggest that you read this. McGee did a really good job. I do disagree with some of these conclusions here. So the National Committee does not dispute that Wiley was a sustaining member in good standing when he renewed. Correct. The National Committee does dispute that Wiley's membership rights were violated. Correct. The National Committee asserts that the chair and the National Committee acted within its authority in declaring the earlier election to be null and void due to his ineligibility. Correct. As such, the National Committee respectfully requests that petitioners' requests for 2, 3, and 5 be denied in full, and that petitioners' requests for 1 and 4 be granted in part, meaning that Wiley was a sustaining member in good standing when he renewed, but not prior to his removal, and that after they redid the election, he's calling it ratification here, that the results were valid. Absolutely true. This is the sentence I have a problem with. Finally, the National Committee welcomes any guidance from the Judicial Committee on how to handle future situations of this nature. That is completely wrong. So, in order to get to that, we're going to go to the amicus brief that I filed. Let me make sure this is up on screen properly. Yes, in fact it is. Okay, let's make it a little bit larger. Because this is what I'm most familiar with, we're going to go over this more thoroughly, even though I do not repeat, with slight exception, the arguments of the LNC. So, I know that I'm writing in support of the LNC with one exception. I respectfully disagree with the LNC's position that petitioners' request for relief 6 should be granted. This stance implies that the JC possesses an advisory or recommendatory role beyond its explicit mandate, which it does not. So, number 6, seeks the JC to recommend adoption of clear, uniform procedures governing sustaining rules, so on. We read that before. Such a recommendation exceeds the JC's narrowly defined authority under the LP bylaws, which is strictly adjudicative, not advisory or consultative. And here's the bylaw that we read: upon appeal, so on. This bylaw is going to be really important as we go on. This provision confines the JC to a reactive, veto-oriented function focused on concrete disputes over existing LNC actions. It does not empower the JC to issue prospective guidance, policy recommendations, or suggestions for bylaws amendments, because that's a role reserved for the bylaws committee or the delegates assembled in convention. Now, the JC has done this in the past. In the Phillies case, it made bylaws recommendations or policy manual recommendations. That was so inappropriate. And I don't believe they should do so here. That is not the role of the JC. I argue more fully under the heading, the JC is not an advisory body. Let's see. Let's scroll down here. So here's the thing. The JC is not something that's contemplated at all in Robert's Rules of Order. There's nothing like a standing judicial body for ongoing rule interpretations outside of meetings in Roberts. Instead, Roberts vests interpretive authority in the presiding officer during session, subject to appeal, or in the assembly itself. So I argue that the JC's scope must be interpreted through an analogous parliamentary principles and common sense, ensuring that it aligns with the bylaws text. Okay, so I think this goes into two sub-arguments, and I say there are committees tasked with proposing amendments. That's the bylaws committee, and actually the LNC is not a committee, it's a board, but the LNC is tasked with creating special rules of order. And over above both of these, the delegates assembled in convention hold ultimate authority. The JC is nowhere given this role. And I say inserting the JC into this domain would grant it a privileged interpretive or recommendatory voice. That they should not use their position of privilege for that. They have one job to do, and that's the only job they should do. They've messed up on this in the past. They should not repeat that mistake here. But here's the thing that the LNC response did not touch on, and I spend most of my amicus dealing with this, and this is what I really, really want you guys to understand. So the JC should not render decisions on dead issues, meaning LNC decisions without continuing force and effect. Now, this somewhat affects me personally, or it's something that I've been personally involved with. As you know, the LNC purportedly removed me from office in 2021, and the Reno Convention overturned that. Now, I was being advised by Jonathan Jacobs at that time. I'd be really interested if now, everyone's entitled to change their mind. But I'd be really interested if Mr. Jacobs disagrees with what I say here, because everything I say here is what I learned from him. So I was advised that if that alleged removal was not overturned at the Reno Convention, it could never be overturned, because once an issue is dead, meaning it doesn't have continuing force and effect, you can't overrule it. So if I was illegitimately removed in 2021, that term of office did not end until adjournment sine die of the 2022 convention, at which point there would have already been an election for the next LNC secretary term, and my alleged term would have ended no matter what, and it was a dead issue. Hopefully you're following that. The removal was overturned at the 2022 convention, meaning that I was never removed. That couldn't have been done at the 2024 convention, because there was already an intervening election for LNC secretary. Whether it was me or not, I happened to have won in 2022, but that's irrelevant as to who it was, because that's a brand new term. So, and now the JC cannot, I'm going to argue that they should not. render decisions on dead issues. A controversy is live only if it has continuing force and effect. Does that make sense to you guys? Because this is the fatal issue. The LNC response did not touch upon this at all. And I'm not criticizing them for that. I'm just saying it gave me something to write about, so I'm happy. The JC's authority, as stated, is limited to considering appeals that challenge whether a decision of the National Committee contravenes specified section of the bylaws with the power to veto such decisions and declare them null and void. And I say, this authority is properly exercised only when the challenged LNC decision has tangible ongoing impact. Here, the petition admits Mr. Wiley resigned post-ballot election, but claims the issues, quote, are capable of repetition and warrant authoritative clarification. I could have easily have said that in mine, but I recognize that if the challenge 2021 vote of the LNC had to be overturned before adjournment sine die in 2022. And we're going to go here. However, Roberts prohibits rescinding motions, because that's basically what the JC would be doing, that do not have continuing force and effect. So let's go to Roberts 35.2.2, because I think this is critically important here. This is for section 35 under rescind or amend something previously adopted. And under the standard descriptive characteristics of rescind under 35.2, subparagraph 2, can be applied to anything, e.g., bylaw, rule, policy, decision, or choice, which has continuing force and effect. Okay. And further states that bylaws breaches are subject to appeal only when they have continuing force and effect. So let's go to that, 23.6a. That was cited in the LNC's opinion, but not for the continuing force and effect part. Actually, I should have made that 23.6b. I'm probably going to write the JC. I made a typo there. And a point of order. So the only exception to the requirement that a point of order must be promptly made at the time of breach, and then it gives one of the exceptions. I typed A and I meant B. A main motion has been adopted that conflicts with a main motion previously adopted and still in force. So the main motion previously adopted would have been the adoption of the bylaws. Now, whether that's a main... That's an interesting question, but in any event, I'm trying to determine quickly in my head whether that would, well, that would have been a main incidental motion. In any event, you get the point. These rules bar adjudication of resolved matters. The LNC's initial voiding was superseded by a later valid election, but crap, remind me, actually, maybe, hold on one second. I'm going to do that right after that show and say that I mistyped that. That bothers me that I mistyped that. So the LNC's initial voiding was superseded by a later ballot election, leaving no active decision for the JC to veto, as the matter has been fully resolved without continuing effect. But I give now an argumentum ad absurdum to say what they are saying if they say that you can litigate a dead issue. A further nonsensical result of entertaining moot appeals would be to set a precedent allowing petitioners to dredge up years-old dead LNC issues with no current relevance. Since JC opinions are not binding precedent, as the petition itself notes, prior decisions are informative but not binding, issuing rulings on dead issues is doubly futile. They provide no enforceable guidance. So he's asking for guidance, but it isn't guidance because they're not binding. So I ask, for example, hypothetically, could I once again appeal the now dissolved RFK Jr. joint fundraising agreement to the next JC elected at the upcoming national convention with an argument that was not raised in my initial appeal? or even just raise it again with a new JC since rulings are not binding, even though the agreement has expired and holds no continuing force. If this Martin appeal is valid, I should be able to appeal that over and over and over again, including 20 years from now. What effect would it have? It would have no effect. Do you understand how this is nonsensical? And then I more fully expand on what the LNC said, that the original agreement it can't contradict LP bylaws. So regions are subordinate entities. Whether y'all like that word or not, that's what they are. Go on about the autonomy argument. An interpretation of regional autonomy allowing Wiley's election, despite his lapsed status at the time of its purported election, would create such a conflict, rendering that interpretation void. Limitations on subordinate entities arise from the rules of the parent body, as R&R notes that while a society is free to adopt rules, these are constrained by parent organization restrictions. You can look it up yourself. Now, here's an issue that wasn't dealt with at all by the JC, and we're going to spend the rest of our time on this. And here's where I'm going to admit, I'm going to reverse a prior position. This is where I said, you're free to change your mind on things. So I know, well, first, let me say what I'm talking about here. Martin submitted just a list of names. It wasn't even signatures. You know, you remember that Seinfeld episode where Jerry reserved a car, but when he got to the reservation counter, the car wasn't there? And the lady's like, oh, we got your reservation. We just don't have the car. I should have clipped this out. And Jerry goes, the reservation has two parts. The most important part is holding the car. Anyone can take reservations. Same thing. Anyone can list names. How do you know they consented to this appeal? How? So something you guys will probably, well, won't know, now you'll know, is once I read this appeal, I wrote the JC and said, do you have signatures? This is not a valid appeal. You cannot take this appeal without signatures. And I had an argument back and forth with the JC chair. They're going to decide what they're going to decide, but I still believe that they have time to reverse that. Mr. Martin did not submit signatures. Therefore, it is not, per that bylaw we read earlier, upon appeal of a certain number of national delegates from the last convention or 1% of the party sustaining membership. You can't just list a name. For all you know, any of you listeners, your name might be on that list. Because not only did he not get signatures, the list is being kept secret. How do you know? None of us can look at this. Now, it had been my position in the past, and I believe it's wrong now. I do change my mind on many things because I've submitted appeals in which the names were kept secret, but I also submitted them with signatures. Now, the reason for secrecy is that there are some nasty people in this party, and I'm not saying they're all just on one side or multiple sides, whatever. And there has been personal retaliation against people. Back when Angela had resigned and, you know, they were trying to fill officer positions, there was people whose employers had been contacted, whatever. There's always going to be people like that. I'm not blaming it on one side or the other. There had been retaliation for people who had signed George Philly's petition. So when I asked for signatures for various appeals I had been involved in, the signatories were told, we will attempt to keep your names private, but there is no guarantee. And the JC kept them private. I now think even the request was wrong, but at least I had gotten signatures. Martin did not even get signatures. So now that you have that background, let's go on. I said, first, I have to repudiate a past position that I held That being that signatures triggering a jurisdictional threshold for JC review could be filed under seal. Under seal means private. I've come to be convinced, partly through a lively back and forth with Mr. Krawchuk, he's a member of the JC, who doesn't think they should be secret, that such is illogical under the bylaws, the JC appellate rules, and member transparency. Upon appeal by in the LP bylaws means they are literally joining in the appeal, which requires consent and agreement to the substance of the petition or an agreement to let a primary appellant or appointee speak for them. Anytime I sent out a petition for people to sign on to appeal, it also included consent for someone to speak for them based upon certain bylaws. No one should be able to just claim that others agree with them in any binding way without a showing of that agreement or consent, typically via signature, which matches the decades-long practice of the JC. So here I am invoking party practice, but I'm primarily invoking the party bylaw. The JC must determine if standing is established before taking a case. There is no standing without meeting the petition threshold, just as much as if there is no standing if there's no subject matter jurisdiction. The JC appellate rules also support this position. The petition must contain the verifiable identity of each member, affiliate, or party committee petitioning for the requested ruling. Not just their identity, their verifiable identity. And I submit that such a requirement would be satisfied by a wet or electronic signature. And also in the rules, copies of petitions and responses and amici shall be available electronically to any sustaining member upon request. Now, the petition must contain the identity, and copies of petitions shall be made available to any member. I requested the identity of the signatories. I was denied. So I said, I did request the names and was summarily denied. So I was denied by just one JC member. Despite that rule, no showing that the JC by a 2/3 vote suspended that rule and my status as a life member. I also argued that signatures were required, and I was told that the LNC authorized representative was given the names for verification and that there was an agreement from the JC to keep the names secret. And I ask, what agreement? How is that valid? Further, disclosure to the LNC, who's under no obligation for secrecy, defeats the entire purpose of the petitioner's request, which is based upon fear of retaliation, since the petitioner, Austin Martin, has been claiming retaliation by the LNC for months now. Additionally, and then I got told by the JC member, well, I can't believe that any petitioner would falsify a list of names. So I said, any argument from incredulity that a petitioner would falsify a list of names will not do. Any deficiency could be inadvertent. I'm certainly not accusing anyone, but there can be no incredulity, since appeals by their nature often accuse the LNC of at least some form of wrongdoing or error. So trust but verify is the rule. If it is not incredible that the LNC could have done wrong, unintentionally or otherwise, due diligence requires that same scrutiny to the other side. And I say the petition should be dismissed without prejudice, meaning that it can be brought again, given the petitioner time to provide signatures and for the names to be made public. And I add a little bit to what the LNC said. I said, Wiley was ineligible at the time of election, resulting in an invalid election. I say I will respect the time of the JC and not repeat the well-presented arguments made by the LNC, though I might quibble with terms like applicability of the parliamentary device of ratification. The result of the second Region 1 vote was effectively redoing the election despite what words were used. Okay. I go on to say I must personally object to a mischaracterization in the petition as follows. Neither the chair nor the secretary is granted unilateral authority, blah, blah, blah. And I said, it's a good thing that the secretary, me, did no such thing. My public notice of Mr. Wiley's ineligibility was issued at the time at the direction of the chair. The chair does, in fact, have authority to make rulings on the interpretation of the LP bylaws. Those rulings can then be properly appealed, which it was in this matter, and the ruling of the chair was sustained. When an ineligible candidate is purported to be elected, it is an invalid election, as a candidate must be eligible at the time of election. So let's look this up. 4649A. Hopefully I didn't miscite this one like I did the other one, which really bothers me. 4649A. If an individual does not meet the qualifications for the post established in the bylaws, his or her election is tantamount to the adoption of a main motion that conflicts with the bylaws. Let's look up 5423 as well. This one's a little bit, it's analogous, if I remember correctly. 5423. The members for whom one can vote, this is in an election, are not limited to nominees, since each member is free to vote for any member who is not made ineligible by the bylaws. Wiley's election as an ineligible, non-sustaining member constituted a continuing breach of the bylaws, making it null and void. Upon a sustained ruling of the chair declaring such, there was no removal since he never properly occupied the position. No disciplinary action was required because he wasn't on the LNC. And then here's where I talk about distinguishing from the rights case. I'd say I would note that the rights case is not binding in any event, and I personally disagree with the reasoning in that decision, and do believe that a lapse during one's term does vacate the seat if the lapse persists for longer than 1 month due to the wording of the bylaws, which specify a 12-month period in which to pay dues, not 365 days. So I think a portion of a month counts as a month. Thus, I would have come to the same conclusion in rights because he renewed within the month, but from a different reasoning. In this matter, Wiley's cure would not matter, even if the eligibility requirements which were ignored, which they should not be ignored and cannot be retroactively cured, as his lapse comprised several months. One must be eligible at the time of election as demonstrated in the LNC brief, and then I refer them to a national parliamentary argument that I attach here. And we're going to go over this because it's so directly on point. We're only going to go over the points that are on point. So I put that here. This was in the National Parliamentarian, I think in 2019. And in this example, there is an organization and the bylaws say that officers must live within 30 miles of the city central. The elected vice president decided to run for president, but right before the election, she moved, or he moved, I think it was a she in this, they moved, let's just put it that way, from one part of town to the other that put them outside of 30 miles. They were elected. Later it was discovered that they lived more than 30 miles outside of the city center and lived more than 30 miles outside the city center at the time of election. And here's the answer. This is not a situation where there was an error in the conduct of the vote, which would have required an immediate challenge. Now, you notice that these RONR citations look different. This is because it was the previous edition, but that's still in this edition. You used to cite RONR by page and line number rather than chapter and verse, the way it is now. So it says this is a continuing breach. This means that the president's eligibility can be challenged by point of order in a meeting at any time that the president remains in office. The president cannot cure the deficiency by length of stay in office. And then it goes on to some other things that aren't an issue here. Moreover, the president cannot cure the defect by becoming eligible after the election. For example, in this case, by moving back to her prior home within 30 miles of the city center. A candidate must be eligible for the office at the time of their election. The election is therefore null and void, and the putative president is removed from office immediately upon being challenged. In this case, that means that the election was incomplete. Okay, I think this is so clear. Martin is just out of his tree. Even if he was right on that issue, it's dead. it wouldn't matter. But he's wrong on the issue. But even if he is right, it's a dead issue. The role of the JC. Can we come up with an LNC decision from 40 years ago and litigate that, even though it has absolutely no validity anymore? Because it might happen again. Well, that's when you challenge it, when it's live. So did this make sense to y'all? I hope so. If you're watching this after the fact and you found this useful, I'm going to put something else on the screen that I want you guys to read. We are going to transition for a second. We might end up doing a show on this, but I want to show you this article. So let me get it on the screen and then I'll show you. It has to do with Angela McArdle and just the arguments that are being made. I'm looking for my Substack. So you all can go. I don't write very much on Substack, but when I do, it's fire, but I don't do it that much. So we're going to put this on the screen. You all can, we're not going to read this here. You all can go check it out for yourself. But this is an article I wrote on Substack. Let's make this a little bit larger. That has to do with the defense that is being made of McArdle right now. So financial interest, never heard of her, says the woman whose partner got the money. So it has to do with the letter that McArdle's attorney wrote. So go check that out. The Substack is called Pink Flame of Liberty. I don't charge for my Substack. I don't write very much on it, but of course you could be a free subscriber and get notified anytime that I do. I really have to have a bee under my bonnet to write something in Substack. Okay, that's going to be it for this evening. I hope this was informative. As further filings come in, if there are any, and I'm sure there will be in this appeal, we'll do short shows and go over them. And if I can, I will live stream the JC hearing. And if you're wondering if the LNC has yet set that executive committee meeting to consider litigation against the chair that they promised was going to be sent pretty soon after the litigation committee meeting on Thursday. No, it hasn't been reset yet. So write your LNC representative. Okay, that is it for this evening. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant